everybody, and welcome to a session to try to make sense of how you in the audience, or anyone else watching, can frame what's going on today with ESG, with the energy transition, with the wider question of where on earth are we going in the world. I'm going to be offering you a slightly different set of ideas from what you've been hearing about earlier and will hear about for the rest of the day. Because the reality is, we live in a world which is pretty confusing, pretty shocking, pretty weird, depending on how you're feeling. It's not just the case that we've had a series of shocking events in the last year, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, like the pandemic, like geopolitical tensions around Taiwan, or the populism, all the surprise political results. These are all shocking. But perhaps a bigger thing to think about is that many of the assumptions that you all grew up with about how the world worked are starting to essentially break down. I'm a journalist. I work with the Financial Times, and I remember very clearly going to the World Economic Forum in Davos back in 2007 and joking to my colleagues that the kind of people who attended Davos were a bit like members of a tribe, a cult, call it what you will, who believed that the world was driven by 3 or 4 key assumptions: that democracy, globalization, free market capitalism, innovation were automatically good things, and most crucially, that they would keep increasing in the world almost indefinitely into the future. That was a kind of assumption that shaped Davos man and the few Davos women that were there. It was the assumption that tended to permeate the way that most businesses, economists, policymakers looked at the world. And when they were drawing up their wonderful models and balance sheets, the idea was that we lived in a world where essentially free market capitalism, globalization, democracy, innovation were embedded and would keep intensifying. Well, newsflash. Since 2007, since the great financial crisis, all of those elements have slowly started to crumble or at least be questioned. Free market capitalism began to essentially get a big knockback after the 2008 crisis, and the story of the last decade or so has been that the state in many Western countries has been increasingly getting involved in the economy. Democracy is on the retreat or under attack in much of the West, and the rise of China has presented a vision of a system which is very different and an alternative that's been looked at closely around the world. The idea of globalization is definitely in retreat all over the world, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's very hard to be optimistic about this naive, or rather optimistic, idea of globalization taking root again anytime soon. So it's a very confusing, very unpredictable, very unfamiliar type of landscape. And that raises the question of how do you make sense of it? How do you look forward? Because in the late 20th century, when this rather optimistic triumvirate of Davos man was deeply embedded, when people thought we were in a world which was becoming more free market, more globalized, more democratic, in that period, there was a tendency for people to use things like economic models, corporate balance sheets, big data sets as their key compass to navigate the world. Nothing wrong with that. Economic models, big data sets, corporate balance sheets are really useful tools. They're really useful compasses. But they all share a flaw. And the flaw is this: they're only as good as what you put into your economic model and where you draw the boundaries. What you leave out can matter. And in the last few years, as the landscape has become so uncertain, the context of our models, of our big data systems, of our balance sheets has started to really matter. What we've been leaving out of the models, things like medical risk, the pandemic, things like climate change, which never used to feature in any of the economic models 20 years ago, things like geopolitical risk, the chance that Russia might suddenly invade Ukraine. All of that has been left out of the models, out of our balance sheets for many years. The context of our intellectual tools really matters because the context is changing. And that begs the question, how do you make sense of the world today? So I want to give you some ideas which are probably very different from what most of you have been trained to think about, because I'm guessing that most of you are trained in the field of economics or engineering or business or things like that, which are fantastic trainings. But I want you to think about today something that you've probably never thought about before, which is a world that I actually grew up in before I became a financial journalist, which is a world of cultural anthropology. I was an anthropologist before I became a financial journalist, and I passionately believe that it's an incredibly interesting field to be using today. Because people who are outside anthropology tend to think, well, what do anthropologists do? They go out, they study human beings. It's a bit like being Indiana Jones. You go off to somewhere wild and wacky, you go to study strange people who seem totally exotic to you, you come back with great stories, colorful photographs, maybe make a documentary about it. You look kind of really cool at the parties, but it's actually pretty useless if you want to look at the modern world. Well, the reality is that stereotype might have been true 150 years ago, because anthropology has a pretty shameful history of racism and sexism and imperialism. But in the last few decades, anthropology has changed dramatically. Today, anthropologists study Western contexts, Western companies, modern industrial world, as much as non-Western contexts. And what defines anthropology is not so much what you study, it's how you look at the world. And how anthropologists look at the world has lessons which are really relevant to all of you trying to navigate the world and to try and make sense of ESG. And the reason is this. What anthropologists essentially do is go on a three-part intellectual journey. The first step is they believe in trying to make the strange familiar, in recognizing that human beings have an enormous, amazing variety of ways to look at the world, and other people don't always think the way that we do. Duh. Sounds really obvious. We kind of all know this in theory, but wow, do we forget it on an everyday basis. And anthropologists are dedicated to immersing themselves in the way that other people think to understand a different point of view. But they do that not just to understand other people who seem different, but because immersing yourself periodically in the way that other people think is the single best way to understand yourself. The reason is, the Chinese have a wonderful proverb that a fish can't see water. None of us can see the assumptions that shape us, that we've inherited from our surroundings, unless we periodically jump out of our fishbowl, go swim with other fish, and then look back. And the reason it matters is when you do that, you can then start to see not just the parts of the world that you talk about all the time and you notice, but the bits that you don't. All your hidden biases, all your assumptions, all the things that you ignore every day because they seem boring or geeky or dull or taboo or whatever. Anthropology is all about social silence, about looking at what we think is so obvious we never even talk about it, about recognizing that one of the assumptions that Davos Man had back in 2007 was that democracy, free market capitalism, and globalization were obviously good things and would only ever keep increasing, and that everyone knew that. Today, when we look back at 2007, we know that wasn't true, but back then, almost no one challenged it. Now, that all sounds very theoretical. Let me quickly explain what I mean and how you can use this in relation to my own life. As I said, I actually started life as an anthropologist. I started off doing the first step of anthropology, making the strange familiar. That's me back many, many, many years ago. In the last few days of the Soviet Union, I went off to Tajikistan, a place I suspect most of you have never been, and I spent a few years of my life living in a Tajik village, essentially immersed in Tajik culture. And I went through the first stage of anthropology, which was realizing when you have the courage and the humility to take away your preconceptions and to try very hard to think yourself into the mind of other people, guess what? You don't just discover that they think differently from you, you also realize that many of your preconceptions about them were wrong. As I say, it's very obvious. It's something we don't often do at all. And it really matters. If only more Western business leaders had borrowed a little bit of the anthropology principle before the beginning of this year and realized that the way that people like Putin and other leaders in Moscow were looking at the world was not the same as Western business leaders or policymakers assumed. They had the trappings of capitalism. They didn't necessarily have the same thought processes. If only more people had done that in the past, then the invasion of Ukraine might not have been such a shock. Anyway, so I spent a couple of years studying Tajik wedding rituals, looking at Tajik society, realizing that almost everything I thought about the Tajiks before I went was wrong. And then, having done that, went back to a world that is much more familiar than most of you, became a financial journalist, and started living and working in the City of London, and then Wall Street and Washington and Tokyo, and looking at modern capitalism. Now, in some ways, that seems familiar. But something I kept trying to do was to take my training in Tajikistan and use all the systems I'd learned to deconstruct Tajik wedding rituals and look at some of the rituals of the modern business world. Things like the Davos World Economic Forum, things like the way that the media works, the television works, things like the way that central banks work. And by looking at the world through that lens that I was inhabiting, that enabled me to see social silences. Looking at social silences in 2005 helped me to see the stuff that financiers weren't talking about at the time, which was the explosion in credit derivatives and all the incredible intellectual tensions that were haunting that world that later caused the great financial crisis. But using that same system of looking very clearly for social silences, looking at a situation and trying to ask constantly, okay, there's all this noise, but what are people not talking about? What are they missing? How are people who I'm looking at so consumed by this sense of tribalism and tunnel vision, so much in their own fishbowl with fish like them that they can't see the obvious? Asking those questions also helped me just go into Silicon Valley, the tech sector, in 2012, 2013, and to try and make sense of what was happening there, and to spot that in many ways you could see as far back as 2012 that the kind of tribal patterns, the tunnel vision, the blindness that was developing in the tech sector in 2012 looked very similar to what was developing in Wall Street back in 2006 and 2007. There were signs of the tech clash that was looming. There were signs of the problems with ad tech, all the things that happened with Cambridge Analytica. It was all there, hidden in plain sight in 2012, just as everything that caused the great financial crisis was hidden in plain sight in 2006. But you just had to look for it. You just had to ask the question, what are people not talking about? What are we missing? And I would argue that you can use that same mindset to make sense of so many of the things that are turning our world and turning our analysis upside down. I mean, I remember going to Davos 2 or 3 years ago, in 2019, and trying to remind myself as I went around the World Economic Forum to not just listen to what everyone was talking about, but what they were not talking about. To see what sessions were completely unattended because no one really cared about it. And in 2019, I noticed that one session that was almost completely unattended and no one bothered to go to was about, guess what? Pandemics. I kid not. And I sat down and I started talking to the scientists, and I realized that, as so often, the reason why no one was really talking about pandemics in the mainstream media was because epidemiology, like so many areas of our modern world, is full of jargon, full of geeky, technical stuff that most people are not trained to make sense of. And most people in the media and the wider world, when faced with a lot of jargon and gobbledygook they don't understand, the natural reaction is not to say, wow, this is a social silence, I should dig into it. They say, oh, God, so boring. It's a bunch of geeks. That was true of financial innovation. It was true of the ad tech space. It's true of almost any area of the world where essentially you have a tiny pool of technocrats who understand what's going on and almost nobody else does, even though it affects us all. So pandemic risk was another area of social silence back in 2019. But it's not the last. We're still surrounded by numerous other areas of social silence. And it's beholden on all of us to keep digging, to keep asking, what are we not asking? What would look weird if I was a Martian who suddenly landed and looked at my familiar world today? What am I missing? And that brings me to the last point, which is ESG. Now, you're probably wondering, what on earth ESG, what on earth sustainability has to do with this? And the answer is, there's actually rather an encouraging message here, which is that if you think about what I've been arguing about the limitations of economic models, of balance sheets, the fact that all of those tools are useful, but you tend to just look at what's in the model and ignore what's outside it at your cost, then you can see that one of the very interesting things about ESG is that it tries to subvert that mentality. It tries to take almost an anthropologist view of the world. What ESG essentially says, what sustainability says, is actually this stuff that wasn't in the balance sheet before, like climate change, like social inequality issues, like medical risks, all that stuff that we used to ignore actually kind of matters. When you start talking about stakeholders, not shareholders like Milton Friedman, what you're also saying is, let's try and take a broader view. Let's try and get out of tunnel vision to lateral vision, peripheral vision. Let's try and see the context of our world. That, to my mind, is one of the easiest ways to actually define what's going on today with the whole sustainability revolution. And frankly, it's much more interesting than sitting there and endlessly saying, okay, what kind of acronyms are we going to have? Is it going to be ESG? Is it going to be CSR? Is it going to be whatever else? When you get away from the immediate issues of ESG and the frameworks and all their flaws and say, actually, what is going on today is a revolution in how we look at the world, moving from tunnel vision to lateral vision. And it's a revolution that's not going to be unwound anytime soon. You begin to understand how the zeitgeist has really shifted in the last few years. I happen to believe that one of the key reasons it's shifted is precisely because of what I started off talking about, which was that Davos man, Davos woman, until 2007, thought the world was a place driven by globalization, free market capitalism, democracy going endlessly in one direction. They had that sunny, confident assumption, the idea that history had ended, to quote Francis Fukuyama. And the story of the last decade has been realizing gradually, bit by bit, that that has been going wrong. There's been a recognition that you need to take a wider view and look at the context, even though most people can't articulate it. I think that's one reason why the world's woken up to the need for sustainability and stakeholderism. But whatever the reason, the reality is that zeitgeist shift has happened. We're all starting to take a more anthropological view, even if we don't quite realize it. We're all starting to realize that if your economic model is like a compass, you don't want to throw it away, but it's a bit like walking through a dark wood at night. If you just stare down at your compass all the time, no matter how brilliant it is, you're going to walk into a tree. So, my final point would be this. If you know an anthropologist, hug them. Ask them how they look at the world. Try and borrow a little bit of that mindset. I'm not arguing that it's going to be the only thing that you can use to understand the world, but adding a bit of anthropology into economics, into finance, into chemical engineering, into law, into computer science, into almost any field, finding ways to look at the context and finding ways to ask yourself, what is a social silence here? What am I missing? Is perhaps one of the most powerful tools that you can use in a world that's driven by extreme flux. And it's also a very powerful tool if you want to try and make sense of where ESG is going. So thank you for listening. If any of you have got kids who want to study anthropology instead of accounting, don't get too cross, they will yet get a job. And best of luck to all of you in navigating these confusing times. Thank you.